now move on to, as I talked about, we're going to be looking at some of the semantic shifts that we've seen this year. And one of them is definitely from safety to security. So I'm going to ask my panelists if they could join me up on stage, just as I introduce the context of this conversation. So this year, as we talked about, we've seen an increased focus on AI security in the global AI governance debate. And we've talked about that in a few sessions already today. Concerns around AI security were believed to be a determining factor at the conclusion of the France AI Summit in Paris. And we've seen, as we talk about, AI Safety Institute here in the UK being named. We've seen the US Institute being named as well. So this raises the question of whether, have we witnessed a fundamental shift in the AI discussion from safety to security, or is this just a matter of semantics, and as Anthony said at the beginning, the work is still carrying on, it's being called different things. So we wanted to unpack that and explore whether a fundamental shift has occurred. If it has, what's been gained, potentially what's being lost, and what does this mean for this community? What does this mean for the digital ethics community, particularly with the India Summit looming in February? So we have an amazing panel to discuss this issue with. I'm going to start here. We've got Philip Suto, who's the Global Director of Tech Policy at Clifford Chance. We've got Susanna Odell, Government Affairs at Microsoft. Andrew Strait, Head of Societal Resilience at the AI Security Institute. Henry D'Azzuto, who's Visiting Fellow of Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative, and Serafina Golden-Tarrant, Head of AI Safety at techUK. Please, can we welcome them in the normal way? All right, so a lot to get into this quite meaty conversation. Thank you all for being here. I've been really looking forward to this one. No pressure. So this is a question for all of you, and perhaps Serafina will start with you and we'll work our way down if that's okay with you. So this year we've seen change in AI governance language. We've heard a lot more about sovereignty than I think we've ever heard before. Security being that topic of conversation. So have we seen a fundamental shift this year, or is it just semantics? Is it a reframing of the AI debate? And if so, what forces do you think have driven this?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I don't know if this would be satisfying or not, but I think I will come down on that they're not mutually exclusive. Like I will probably come down. I'm sure that given my other answers on that it's predominantly semantics, in that like the work that I'm doing now has changed a great deal over the past year, but it changes because risks change and model capabilities change, rather than because terminology changes. So it has more been like, as you get more agentic or as you get deployed in different contexts, then my work changes. Yeah. But also the fact, so I would essentially consider it I'm a scientist, I would consider it a political rather than a scientific shift. But that isn't meaningless, right? Like that affects funding structures and stuff like that in research institutions and things like that. So I would say it is just semantics from a predominantly technical standpoint, in that like everyone who cared about risk was already thinking about the whole space, which includes what most people define as security now, and what people used to define as safety, and the sort of blurry middle ground. And people who were doing it well were doing both to begin with. But it is a political shift that can therefore have knock-on effects. So yeah, yes and no.
Fair answer. Henry, what would you say, yes or no to, or are you a bit more, definitive on one side or the other?
No, I mean, I think I fundamentally agree. I mean, it's just worth saying to the people who don't know, so I'm at Oxford now, but before that I worked in Number 10 as the Prime Minister's Advisor on AI, so I was behind the Bletchley Park Safety Summit and setting up the BASI as well as other things. And I think if you look at the work, for example, at Bletchley, it was called the Safety Summit, but what was the discussion actually about? It was about what we were calling catastrophic risks, and that was, do the models allow people to help non-state actors, terrorists build biological weapons, chemical weapons, carry out attacks in cyber that you wouldn't have wanted them to do, as well as some other stuff around loss of control. That's what it was focused on. I think the truth is those are all security issues, and therefore that kind of work was carrying on in the same way. And we can talk about like why the language might have changed. I think work is carrying on in a similar fashion. I think think what has definitely changed is certainly more focus on countries thinking about what their role is in a world where incredibly powerful AI exists, and in particular, what role do the middle powers have to play when the truth is it is the Americans and the Chinese that have the model companies. That's an extremely difficult question, and it's had led to lots of people thinking lots of different things. I'm not sure many people have got an answer, but that is the big question that I think has pushed the debate in the last year or so.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Andrew, great to have you with us. So what's your view, semantics or just a reframing of the conversation?
I can't imagine when you asked me that question. Yeah, well, as a member organization that has changed their name, in my view, very much is semantics. You know, we are not doing anything different in terms of the types of risks that we cover in the way that we work. When we're a safety institute from when we are security institutes, we're still looking at the ways in which AI systems might be driving various kinds of severe kinds of societal risks. That includes the way they're impacting or influencing humans, the way they might be changing or enabling new or exacerbating existing forms of fraud or non-consensual imagery abuse. It includes the ways in which the systems might be causing critical over-reliance or fragility risks, especially deployed in critical national infrastructure sectors. And it includes all the ways in which we try to then mitigate those risks. How do we actually come up with solutions and ways to address it? I would say that probably the biggest change I've seen in the last year has been a slightly different word, which is about resilience. So we're moving into a world in which no longer can we just try to prevent various kinds of risks. We must also learn how to prepare for those kinds of risks and absorb them and respond to them if they occur. That is a very different framing that has changed a lot of the way in which we consider our funding practices inside the UK Security Institute and the kinds of questions and mitigations that we work on. So a lot of what we're doing now is still very much a prevention absolutely is the top priority, but it's also really trying to build existing societal defenses, or strengthen existing societal defenses, really trying to build new ones where there's a gap, and trying to understand how can we prepare different parts of government, different parts of international governments for those kinds of dynamics. So give one great example. One of the things we're working on right now is doing customer checks at banking institutions. This is sort of the kind of existing self-safeguard that prevents all kinds of fraud. It just creates a fabricated account. And one of the things we're really curious about is can the more advanced AI capabilities, once they're in the hands of everyday users, can those bypass your customer checks in a way that changes the fraud dynamic? It might require some changes to how we think about your customer processes. It's a great way in which we're not doing anything crazy fancy. We're just trying to test an existing safeguard that many institutions outside of banks also use to see if it's still resilient in the current climate that we're moving into. So that, what I'd say, is kind of a big change recently.
Andrew, Susanna, I'd love to get your view here, and from an industry perspective as well. And just, you know, has this then changed in language or change in semantics or change in framing? Has it impacted your approach to issues around AI security, AI safety? You know, have you had to adapt in a different way because the global conversation has shifted? What does it look like for you?
Yeah, thank you, and great to be back at the summit again this year. So I think maybe if I can start a bit broader, which is that I think the external environment hasn't been static over the last kind of 12 months or so. So I think, you know, on the kind of opportunity side, we're continuing to see advances in AI that are offering kind of tremendous potential across things from life sciences and drug discovery through to materials science, as well as kind of broader business productivity. So the kind of that's not static, and that's kind of continuing to evolve. At the same time, we're seeing adoption also kind of grow quite significantly globally. So Microsoft put out our first global AI diffusion index a couple of weeks ago, and that showed that kind of 1.2 billion people globally have now kind of used AI tools in the last 3 years. That's kind of not kind of the same everywhere. You're seeing some kind of certain countries like the UAE, Norway, Ireland, Singapore, for example, be kind of at the top of that list. But I think we're also starting to see the technology kind of broaden out. And I think because of that, it's really important that we continue to build trust in the technology. And so we need to be really clear-eyed around the risks, because those are also evolving. So not to kind of throw too much kind of in terms of stats at you, but again, we kind of published our annual Microsoft Digital Defense report this year, And that showed that, from kind of nation state actors kind of using AI-generated content more in their influence operations, through to kind of AI being used in kind of phishing attempts, and actually those being about kind of 4.5 times more effective in terms of people clicking on the links. And we are seeing that evolve. I think all that to say that when we're thinking about the kind of potential kind of conceptual shifts or not, I think it's really important that we are kind of thinking about how we can create that kind of science of evaluation across multiple different risks. That's something I think the AI Security Institute in the UK is doing, and others internationally. Maybe in terms of kind of how our approach kind of works. We've been thinking about responsible AI for a really long time. We kind of before we started to see kind of AI legislation on the books and some of these kind of external frameworks. I think to kind of cut a long story short, back in 2016 we published our 6 responsible AI principles, and that kind of covered safety and security and privacy. I'm not going to go through all of them. And since then we've kind of evolved our approach as those risks have kind of changed. So we've kind of put out new kinds of reports, we've kind of evolved our approaches and really tried to embrace some of those kind of external frameworks from the kind of NIST AI management framework that I know we've kind of seen and spoken about earlier today, as well as kind of new bits of legislation that we're starting to see. So I think we're really trying to evolve our approach as the risks change, as the production changes, and really thinking about how we can continue to be kind of at the forefront of that.
Thank you. So Philip, same I suppose question to you is, in your view, have we seen a fundamental shift? Or is it just semantics and these issues were always there, it's just the more public perhaps come on to next, why that language has changed? How does it feel to you?
I think they're the same but different, and I think there are sort of 4 trends that we're going to see over the course of next year that are going to crystallise that a little bit more. I mean, we've got regulatory complexity and uncertainty, and there's going to be more of that, especially in the EU. We're going to see a lot more AI in the wild. I mean, we're going to see probably towards the end of next year early adopters of people having, first generation beta robots in their homes.
The physical AI.
Yeah. We are looking at countries and regional blocks that are thinking very carefully about sovereignty and their own sort of sovereign capabilities. And we're also in a world where growth and competitiveness isn't assured. So you have this big landscape, and then you have this sort of, on the face of it, very navel-gazing question. They're the same, but they are different. They're not completely the same, because if you sort of go into the rabbit hole of these communities, and trust me, it's a rabbit hole, safety will trigger, if you do sort of responsible AI word association or a Rorschach test, and you say safety to people in this space, they might say, Eliezer Yudkowsky, existential risk, X risk, because it sounds less crazy. If you say security to people, they'll say things like cybersecurity, what bad actors are doing, supply chain resilience. So on one level, they're sort of dealing with similar things. Safety is thinking about what might a model do itself. It's understanding how models work and how various things emerge. It's thinking about what do you do in a scenario where there is an unexpected increase in capability. Security, and that, to policymakers, that can be incredibly abstract. You'll be in meetings, oh wait, really? It sounds a bit like sci-fi, and you're like, okay, well this isn't working, this isn't sticking. Let's talk about security instead. It's actually a lot of the same stuff, but it has a lot more traction with policymakers. They can get their heads around a cyber attack, or deepfakes and why that's bad for people, or why it's really important to protect critical infrastructure. That stops very quickly being a sort of a weird sci-fi type sort of question, which is where I think we were a couple of years ago. So I think it's also a sort of a symptom of this slightly growing up in a way, which I think is a good thing. None of those sort of fundamental, foundational, slightly imponderable, frankly, challenges have gone away, but now we're thinking about them in a much more operational, instrumental way.
Henry, can I come back to you on this? Because you touched on perhaps we can discuss why the language has changed. So is it just, to your mind, I mean, I was going to ask you about securitization theory, but is it the political context, is it political leaders, is it political drivers here that have changed the language, has changed the kind of the focus? Or what else do you think, why do you think the language has changed this year in particular?
Well, I find the debate slightly odd because I do basically think they are the same thing, and I spent a fair amount of time engaging with the Chinese when we're the best part summers and talking to them about how they look at this stuff. And in Chinese, the word for safety is the word for security, and vice versa. Like, it's literally the same word. So you can imagine, like, we have these kind of like, as Philip was saying, these kind of slightly odd discussions with policy people about the difference between the two, and then you come to Chinese and I don't know what the hell you're talking about. So I find it a bit odd. I mean, I think the truth is that I think some of this has been driven by politics and the change of administration in the US, and therefore, what is it that they care about? What matters? Because we're still in a world where the only people who've got genuinely frontier AI are the US and the Chinese. So, I think, I mean, maybe we'll get into a discussion about all of this, but like how countries like the UK gain some leverage in a world like that. And I was in India 5 weeks ago talking to them about their summit, and they're having exactly the same conversation, except it's even more difficult for them because they've got the Chinese right on their border. So do they go with the US stack or they go with the Chinese stack? That is a huge question for them, much bigger than for the UK. And so what are they ending up doing? They're throwing some money at local homegrown AI companies to see if they can build some stuff locally. I don't know whether that will work, but every country is thinking the same thing because this is the most important technology in humanity's history. It is going to be extremely changing of the world in the next 10, 15 years. And we should assume that where all the money goes, where everything happens, is the people who've got the most frontier powerful AI. Unless some countries do certain things to be part of that, it's going to become a very old place.
It's going to be an interesting topic of conversation at the India Summit in February.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Just want to touch on, Seraphine, if I may, because I was going to ask you how this, because your title is Head of Safety, how the security frameworks impact your work. But you said, the work doesn't change, the risks change. But to that point about the process of resilience, is resilience come into your work and has that changed your work, or is it part and parcel of the security work that you said you do as well?
No, the resilience point is a really good point. I think, so I guess as far as, for ways my work has changed, like I mentioned, it was basically capabilities and deployment contexts are ways that it's changed. And I'm the head of safety. Actually, I feel like it actually slightly answers your safety versus security question in a similar way to Henry did. By the reason that I'm the head of safety instead of the head of security is because the head of security already exists and it's something different. So, and isn't actually what we mean when we're talking about like AI security. Like I still do the AI security stuff when we're talking about malicious use or cyber attacks or something. The head of security is someone who makes sure that our API can't get hacked.
Yeah.
Like just like they've always done.
Yeah.
So I think, but the sort of the security and safety aspects of a frontier model are what I manage. So and ways that it's changed as far as I think it's mostly changed as far as the sort of what you traditionally consider to be security aspects and the safety aspects traditionally considered to be the safety aspects, which are different than what you describe as the safety aspects. They're not like human finance and Kowski, but it is that they're having to be blended a little bit more in agentic systems. Like we were always trying to make them blended, but it's just challenging to like a huge amount of scientific innovation comes from blending different fields, but it's hard to because you have different jargon and different understanding, and so we've basically always been doing that, and we have now more forcing functions. As models become more capable and more complex, we have more forcing functions to blend it more. But I think what that has shifted, I think, is it's made, I think probably my focus, because we're so enterprise focused, is a little bit different than Andrew's as far as my ability to focus on resilience, right? Because you think of it as embedded in a company, which is just a fundamentally different setting. But I think the thing that it has changed that's similar to Andrew's conception of resilience is this sort of focus on user trust and correct user calibration, which is what that would be in an enterprise context, which is what I mean that I started to think about. It's related to the over-reliance thing, but it means that we started to think about, okay, like, if our model, if problems can happen, how do we make it so that those problems, like, you know, you focus on prevention, you try to make problems minimized, but then you know that they'll exist. And, you know, AI is embedded in systems at scale, so a small amount of problems becomes quite broad because it's deployed everywhere. You know, similar to sort of like self-driving cars actually have accidents very, 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 very rarely, but you spend millions of hours driving a car, so that's a problem. And it's similar with other types of AI now, right? So, so I think the enabling better understanding, like better transparency and better understanding of model confidence and capabilities, and like embedding that into the technology. So what I mean is having a user who can look at a model and go, oh, this is likely to be correct, or this is likely to be incorrect, or I understand how this answer got arrived at, or something. And I think that's where resilience fits in, of trying to make it so that user trust is appropriate to the model capabilities, so that any model issues are not as much of a problem because they're not being over-relied on.
Thank you. Really fascinating. So let's move on to, so if we're saying this is semantics, right? The work on safety is carrying on, the work on security is carrying on. But clearly what has changed has been the focus of the conversation, the language that's being used, the narrative that's being put out there. And I wanted to explore, that being the case, what's being gained and perhaps what's being lost. So has the shift in the focus or the conversation or the language being used, is it bringing new conversations? Are we talking, perhaps Andrew can do it, are we talking about issues or areas that we weren't talking about when, forgive me, but when the focus was just purely, when the narrative was just purely AI safety?
Yeah, I don't think the difference there is the semantics. I don't think it's the difference between safety or security. I think the difference is a few different factors. So I think very much what was Sophia. One has been advanced and changed capabilities. Yeah. Another, we're moving into a world of video is now falling, is the last modality. We use a spot, something is generated, and now we have, what do we have? I don't know, it's quite intense, right? We have, I think, the other big one is the pace of adoption, which I find dizzying. A lot of what my team does, we monitor adoption rates. And it's quite staggering how quickly, both in a consumer business-facing context, we're seeing these technologies be adopted for quite sensitive use cases. You know, when I was at AWS Institute 2023, we did a survey of the public just before ChatGPT came out. And we found that about 6% of the population had described, at the time, none had used AI chatbots for companionship or for mental health. We did a survey a year later, we found about 6% of people are now claiming that use case. Today, there's been 2 surveys, one was by AC, another by another body, that finds about 33 to 37% of UK citizens are using AI for mental health or companionship, which is a shockingly high number. It says higher when we talk about teenagers, where about 72% of US teens report using AI for companionship or any concepts of media. There are 200,000 estimated kids in the UK between 8 and 14 years old, according to Ofcom, who are using Character AI and other applications. It's a staggering rate of growth for some of these applications. That's just consumer-facing context. It might be driving psychological risks. Within a business-facing context, we see huge growth in the adoption of agents in certain sectors for high-stakes use cases. And a lot of my team's been doing is tracking where are agents being deployed and used. And we see quite a bit in finance, quite a bit in software and team coding, but even in sectors like telecoms, where again the adoption rates are growing at a fast pace. So the scale and breadth of these cases is changing. I think there's also a lack of clarity of our risk models, which is changing. A good example is, who would have thought a year ago that you could have to worry about whether an agent can open up 10 bank accounts and then move money between them? Because if you can do that, that's the perfect ingredients for either bank runs and liquidity crises in the UK. quite serious systemic risk in the UK. And we did a test to see, can we do that with some of the agents that we work with? We found not yet. For various reasons, there's restrictions in their ability to do that. But we're not far away. And if we don't think about what safeguards and what restrictions we need to put either on agents' actions we don't want to take place, or other safeguards that prevent that kind of outcome from occurring, we're going to be in a bad place. And that's again a challenge I think that we're in. We're having to constantly rethink how are capabilities, how is pace of adoption, how is the kind of breadth and scope of use cases changing the risk landscape. The last thing I'll say is I think the challenge of measuring risk. This is probably the biggest one that I continuously see as an enormous challenge. We understanding the prevalence of some of these risks that you're concerned with. How often are criminals trained to AI to enable defensive fraud? How often are people seeking out suicidal intention and self-harm advice from chatbots? It is a very hard question to answer at the moment. But I'm very optimistic, frankly, about our ability to start to measure that. I think some of the work that we're doing with major labs and with other organizations to try to develop better ways of measuring the prevalence of those kinds of things strikes me as a way in which governments, regulators, policymakers, and crucially the public can better understand how severe, how prevalent are the risks that we're concerned with, and what are ones that might be missing.
Okay, Philip, I'd love to come to you, and that has this shift or has this change in language brought into conversations. What do you think companies are thinking about this? Are companies looking at security and safety issues in a different way than they were perhaps 12 months ago? Have you seen a shift?
I think the fact that the adoption has gone through the roof and that the use cases are now much clearer and the risks are crystallizing is incredibly focusing on people's minds. There was just research out the last couple of days about how smart contracts it's just possible to sort of use AI sort of empowered attacks to siphon off money via smart contracts, even smart contracts where there are no known vulnerabilities. And this was in a sandbox scenario. We've got the attacks that have happened, the cyber attacks that have happened. And this is incredibly focusing on people's minds. Again, I think 2 years ago, a lot of it for maybe companies at the board level, for politicians was somewhat abstract, but we're actually seeing some of the things crystallize, and I think that galvanizes activity. And also, I mean, I work with large tech companies. It's not like people for the last couple of years have not been doing anything. There's a huge amount of work going on to mitigate these risks before things are put out there that people don't generally see.
So, anybody else want to come back on what perhaps we gained? Are we talking about issues or topics that we weren't talking about before?
Yeah, and I think it's worth kind of thinking about the kind of international context for some of this as well. So I mean, I kind of mentioned our kind of responsible AI principles before that are kind of, they remain the bedrock of our approach, and I think the evolving global conversation has kind of just served to reinforce the focus on kind of safety and security.
Yeah.
But I think
so it's helped them.
So it's kind of helpful to reinforce that. I think kind of globally, no country can be thinking about these things in isolation. You kind of need a broad approach to kind of manage and kind of look at these kind of advanced AI systems. And I think one thing that has been gained from kind of the evolving global conversation is actually we're starting to see some of those kind of structures kind of come to life. Kind of, Andrew, to your point around how you kind of map and monitor the risk and kind of think about shared approaches for doing that. We're starting to see that with the kind of International AI Safety Report that came out recently and actually talked about the role of the AI Safety and Security Institutes and being really well resourced to do that and kind of working with companies on that. So I think we're starting to see the kind of fledgling approach there, and then I think also on the kind of science and evaluation as well, and some of the reporting frameworks. So the National AI process reporting framework as well is these kind of we're starting to get to these kind of shared international norms that then kind of allow us to have this much broader approach. And I think that it's worth reflecting that that feels like something that's been gained over the kind of last kind of year or so, and it's happened relatively quickly. I think there's still early stages, and there's lots to be done on that. From a kind of National AI reporting framework perspective. I think, now that we've got that, then kind of doing the next click down on that, which is, how can you then think about what the reporting requirements might be, depending on kind of where you are in the AI value chain. That feels like a kind of helpful next step, but I think it's worth kind of reflecting on the kind of the changes in the kind of structures that we're starting to see.
Thank you. And so, Henry, let's come to you. Anything you think that we've gained that has been helpful in this kind of change of focus or refocus, but also perhaps moving on to, do you think we've lost anything with this as well, with this kind of shift in the conversation? I'm thinking particularly in terms of if we're focusing, if the narrative and the conversation, the language focus on AI security, do we create the risk of creating blind spots, ethical AI safety blind spots that we're not looking at, we're not seeing? Does that make sense? Is there a risk there that if you focus the conversation so much on AI security, even in the language and the narrative that you use, that we will miss things that perhaps we
What
will
kind of
see
things
before?
you worry about?
I suppose the socio-economic impact, the human-centered innovation that Ruben was talking about. If you just focus it on security and even to that point resilience, do we run the risk of missing things that we may have picked up before?
I think, well, I mean, I think there's always like limited bandwidth of like what people can look at and what counts, and therefore certain organisations will take views about what they should focus on, what they shouldn't. I think fundamentally there are brilliant groups like Ruben doing work in other areas, and I think that's carrying on and should carry on. And I don't think like because we talk more about security than safety that should stop. I think what's the right way of saying this? I think some of the people focused on, there was this kind of like strange near-term risks versus long-term risk debate.
Yeah.
And actually the word safety was probably more coded in long-term risk than it was. So in many ways, I think like the no longer saying safety probably makes the short-term risk people happy, if you know what I mean. But the whole thing is ludicrous because the short-term risks are hugely important, as are long-term risks. And what do they fundamentally boil down to? They fundamentally boil down to what the models can or can't do. And everybody's trying to work out what the models can or can't do. And we're in this kind of totally ludicrous situation where the people making these models can't tell you what they can or can't do and predict what they will or will not do. So therefore we're all in it together to try and like work out what's happening, and we're all trying to solve the same problem, which is how does it work, like what can it do, like what risks might that lead to. And also, don't get me wrong, like I built a startup before I went to government. I like massively believe in technology, and I think AI is hugely important and can do incredible things, and I'm very excited about that. But it is a different technology to anything we've ever dealt with in the past. So the only place where I slightly disagree with Ruben is that yes, the people building it have to be like accountable for the fact that they built something that can do certain things or happens to do certain things, but they literally like the way the technology works is that it is different from previous technologies where you do inputs and you know what the output's going to be, and it's not traditional software. And so therefore when people say the AI does do X, Y, or Z, it is basically true because the AI, like it reasons and makes decisions on its own. Like that is the difference. And therefore that's the thing that we've got to try and work through and make sure people understand and why it is actually different from anything that's come before in the past.
Can I just comment very quickly?
Sorry.
We're also in a very dynamic situation where people are working on new architectures that are not LLM architectures. LLM architectures are about language and words and about meaning and prediction. Human cognition doesn't work like that. LLMs can't really go into the space of smell or emotional memory. And it gets sort of very sort of weird and geeky, but we are moving towards a space where there will be sort of world models or attempts to create world models that do start to bring these sort of strands in. So as the technology evolves, we'll have to sort of evolve our approach to how we think about risk management.
I'm sure there'll be robots that can smell soon enough.
The sommelier will be the sci-fi robot of your dreams.
Definitely not my dream.
Has an impact on jobs I wanted to see coming, but Serafina.
Yeah, I mean, I'll also tie it back a little bit into what Ramon said about in things that have been lost. In that I have appreciated in the short-term risks way the grounding of talking about security, right? In that, like, if I'm really interested in like things that are going wrong right now under our noses.
Yeah.
The shift to security does help ground it a little bit because it feels very enterprisey, right? I mean, that is what I think about, but like it feels like that. But I do think what we do slightly lose in that I would like us to keep an eye on, and this is why I'm calling back to her chat, is that security doesn't think about human impact so much.
Yeah.
Like you do slightly abstract the human out of it.
Where the AI safety focus did more?
So if you don't consider it to be an X risky thing, which in an enterprise context it's not really. You know, people are worried about the model like underperforming for a vast segment of the population it has to perform for, or about there being, you know, like particularly crucial errors in a financial application or something like that, right? Or a medical application. Like these are like two of the really big uses, right? And so like an error in a medical summary or something that affects certain types of things is like a safety issue. And those are, and I think when we were talking about safety and responsible AI and the more like ethics side of things, I think it's centered that like the problem with that is that error has happened to a human to some degree. And I think it is to some extent useful to think in those terms because with this incredibly rapid pace of adoption that Andrew is talking about, a huge amount more people end up using a system than you potentially anticipated and definitely than you tested for.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like Henry was saying, it's a little bit ludicrous that model builders can't tell you all these things. I am one of those model builders. I don't think it's that ludicrous actually, but partly because stochastic systems are not that weird, as in like systems that are not deterministic. There actually have been loads of them throughout time. As any sufficiently complex system is really hard to predict to some extent. And the contexts in which it will be used are really hard to predict. You know, like I can take a really, really simple system, like a basic power tool of some type or something along those lines, and if people are using it for all sorts of stuff, like that I might not have any idea what they're using it for, then it would be challenging for me to evaluate it properly. And that's a really simple tool, right? And so now we're dealing with complexity in two areas. Complexity from this insane uptake. So we now have complexity of like, how are you actually using it? How close was that to what it was designed for? And that's not so that I can slap you on the hand and be like, I didn't make it for that. Because that is the way that engineers like me get out of having responsibility for things. But just so that you can test for it and make sure. And so you have this incredible complexity in the system, which doesn't require like anthropomorphization to be that complex. It's just an incredibly complex system that is deployed in a very widely varied set of things that changes very quickly that we don't know about.
Yeah, it's interesting how definitely as adoption deployments, Philip's saying, increases, one we're definitely going to have to look out more for. Andrew, did you want to?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting part of the discussion because I think it touches on something that I've also been grappling with a lot last year about what is different, what is the same. One of the things that I think agents are our great instantiations, where we have a technology that is claiming to be capable of kind of automating certain types of computer-based tasks and can scale those tasks better than human workers can. And I think that raises a different kind of like ethical, let's say, but I was still framing this by a security question. What kinds of tasks, what kinds of actions are we willing to allow to be automated? That's a human decision. It's a firm decision, it's an individual decision, something that we have control over, right? We can decide what we just want to say we don't want to use agents for. And crucially, if we are going to use them, how are we going to use them? What kind of types of tasks we're comfortable completing? I'll give a great example. Like, I had a conversation recently with someone who works in a large financial institution. They're talking about how they are deploying agents, and they're using it for fraud detection. automating a process or workflow that basically is looking at sort of 20 different data sets across an organization. It used to be something that a human would do, so the computer, they would just kind of look and sort of sort through 20 different things and give a flag or notification to a user if it's likely fraudulent charge. Now, there's two ways to think about setting up the agent in that context. One is that you just basically YOLO the agents. You're like, just do whatever you think you're going to do. Don't tell me how to explain the decision. You can do whatever you want on our network and just like figure out if it's fraud. That's a really dangerous, high-risk way of using agents, right? And that's the thing that I slightly worry about, where we're seeing more systems that are being designed not to complete the workflow and with thinking about how the workflow is completed as being highly important, but just getting to the end result. And the way that they're doing it is they're just trying to exactly replicate the way a human would do the workflow, right? That's a human decision. That's something that's within our power. It's an ethical decision. They've chosen to do that to reduce regulatory risk, to increase explainability, to be able to explain why the decision has probably been reached, and then crucially, also to kind of have additional triggers. So there's no ends. It's not like you just automatically flag a transaction. It kind of sends numerous notifications to a user to kind of flag, hey, we think this is fraudulent. So again, fairly low stakes to get something wrong. So you can never factor in. Now those are kind of the kinds of the ethical decisions that still existed in older AI systems that we're grappling with just a different way today, which is what's the appropriate use case? What are the appropriate values? What's the things that are important to me about my use case that I have to keep in mind? Some of those might be cases where how an action is completed, how explainable it is, how much I can justify it is perhaps more important than does it do the thing. But right now, I think we're in this like funny position. You say we're trying to figure this out on a grand scale across every sector of the economy, with a really challenging, difficult, and lack of clarity as to like how to even begin to answer those questions. But I don't see that as a different question. To me, that has always been the challenge of any type of procurement, of any type of technology, in any kind of automation. And it takes time. It takes trial and error. It takes conversations like this, where we kind of share collectively what our failures and challenges are. In this case, I think the biggest exacerbating factor is the pace. It's not something where we have years to kind of figure this out. We're figuring this out in a matter of months before the next big thing.
I just wanted very quickly, Henry, just to come back to you. You mentioned the point about the UK and so is the UK being in, well, I'm going to ask you a question. Is the UK in a good position to have this conversation and to drive these conversations as they evolve? And as Andrew said, and so the really kind of getting into the devil in the detail of these questions. How do you think the UK is positioned to, could we lead those global conversations? Are we in a good position?
Yes, I think the UK is in a very good position to do that. I think it's the only government in the world that is doing genuinely proper testing of models, and what Andrew and the AI Security Institute team have done inside the UK government, I think is sensational. Like being able to build a team of technical experts, people leaving OpenAI, leaving DeepMind, leaving top research institutes, and joining the government to do stuff and take massive pay cuts does not happen very often. And I can't think of any other ones at all. So we're in prime position because of that work, and then we're also in a place where the AI companies, it wasn't always this way at the start. I think it was a tricky relationship, but now the AI companies see UKAC as a partner, I think, and doing good work. OpenAI publicly praising it for finding a universal jailbreak in GPT-5. You could have questions about whether the UK taxpayer should be, helping these American companies make their models safer. But I think fundamentally it's doing an incredible job, and I think there is no other country that is doing it properly. There's AI security institutes or safety institutes in some other countries, but they're taking a much lower tier, but spending much less money. I think other big benefits that the UK have to allow us to be able to have this conversation is we've got, historically, the legal system here is looked upon across the world. I think the bit that's trickier is we don't have a big part of the AI stack. And so when you have kind of conversations with people who do, whether it's financial services, whether it's insurance, whether it's pharma, like these are areas that UK could become the world's superpower in those areas. It just needs to make some tough decisions to do that and double down, gain the leverage, and then be able to have some sort of kind of tougher conversations with people around the world about how they should approach all of this.
I want to, because it's come up a couple of times, I want to disagree with something, with some assumption, because I haven't yet done this when talking, but it seems to come up a number of times, and has come up a number of times on this panel, where there's like almost this like weird sense that I frequently find in policy crowds of an assumption around disempowerment around the UK or something along those lines, where like there's a reason that this question is coming up. And from a scientific perspective, I don't think we actually feel that. I wouldn't agree with the statement that only the US and China have frontier AI. They have like a couple points better on a math benchmark. Like, if we're talking about, no, for real, like...
The UK does not have OpenAI. We've got DeepMind, but it's American. And there's no,
DeepMind started here. Cohere's Canadian, and most of our modeling team is here. Mistral is French.
I know, but if we're going to be brutally honest, there are 3 AI companies in the world that are at the absolute frontier. It's OpenAI, it's DeepMind.
It depends on what you're talking about, though. No, but I'm making this for a point, like not because I want a medal. Like,
I love Cohere and I love Mistral.
Genuinely don't have to. I'm making it for a point that, like, if we're caring about whatever, like cybersecurity risk or issues that can happen from companionship, like in teenagers using things for companion apps, you don't have to have the top 2 points on the math benchmark.
That's definitely
You just have to be sufficiently capable. And as far as sufficiently capable models, like this is becoming more and more distributed as a thing that happens globally. Like everyone has their special sauce, of course, but if we're just talking about like sufficiently capable models to do things that a couple of years ago would have been considered totally incredible, and that are like infusing themselves in people's lives, which is what I really care about from like a safety and security risk standpoint. It's not actually isolated in that particular way. And I probably wanted to bring that up because because at least from a scientific perspective, like a huge amount of the sort of basic technology that caused this is Canadian, French, UK, and it still works on it. And so I guess, I sometimes think it's a strange question.
Thank you for clarifying. Very quickly, because we're running out of time.
I completely agree with all of that. I think there's someone, I think where little powers can do more and should do more is like going hard at adoption and solving the problems that Andrew talked about, and then actually showing the way forward with all of this stuff at that kind of people, I think is definitely doable and should be done.
Yeah, and I think that when you have the technical capabilities, which the UK definitely does, I mean, like, I am American and from Silicon Valley, and I chose to be here. Is that I think a lot of the safety and security issues are like deeply unsexy to some extent, in that like there are a lot of elbow grease and a lot of you figuring out how humans are using them, and then thinking about how you measure it in a way that's like actually predictive. And I think it actually helps to have your feet a little bit on the ground and a little bit outside of the hype cycle and be like, we have, we're actually worried about making this work for our society. And I think it can be a little bit easier to do that somewhere like here.
Yeah, great, thank you, Susanna. And then I'm going to have to end with Philip and Susanna.
I'll be really quick. I think just on kind of the role of the UK, I think I really think about what we're seeing internationally again. So in the US, you've got a lot of kind of state law that's starting to be developed. You've got the EU AI Act across the channel as well. And I think there's a real opportunity for the UK to think about how it can kind of play this like middle path initiator role on the international stage. And I think a lot of it is based on the fact that we do have in the UK one of the most kind of well-resourced and well-advanced kind of ACs and AI security institutes. And I think the research that happens there and the collaboration with industry and again kind of with civil society, we need a kind of broad approach on this. So I think really leveraging that and thinking about what the UK can do on kind of frontier safety and kind of mapping and anything thinking about risk mitigation, as well as things like content provenance as well. There's a kind of package of work that we can really kind of show leadership on.
Thank you. Philip, final word to you, and any final reflections on this conversation, which has been really fascinating, but also thinking about prediction to 2026. Do you see this, okay, if it's not a fundamental shift, if it's purely semantics, but there has been a refocusing on AI security, do you think that will continue as we move into next year?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think 26, 27, we're really going to see as people say, rubber hit the road. We're going to see a lot of this in real life. I think one of the things that has come out of this conversation is just how challenging this is for policymakers and regulators in general. And there's actually only so much you can do if you're a policymaker or a regulator. Like, if you're in a meeting with a policymaker and you say to them, what are you going to do about the impact on employment? It's like, you might as well ask them for the moon on a stick. It's an imponderable question. I think, because we're at techUK, I think the UK does have a tendency, and this is very British, to sort of be very modest and do itself down slightly. I mean, Geoffrey Hinton, Dennis Hassabis, a lot of people have come from here. The UK still has incredible strengths academically. It is seen as a very pragmatic, I would say adult in the room, it's a very pragmatic, sophisticated policy-making environment. People often look at the EU and what it's done with the EU AI Act and the AI Omnibus, and that isn't perfect by any means. A lot of people have taken parts of it, but again, this is really hard to solve for. So is it product safety legislation? At what stage of the tech stack are you going in? How far behind the curtain sort of are you actually going to go? So I think the UK is actually doing a reasonably good job in very, very difficult circumstances.
Well, thank you. And we have overrun, and forgive me for that, but I really wanted to use this expert panel to really unpack these issues and really explore them in depth. And I feel what we've done today. We may not have come to any grand conclusion, but I think what we have shown is that, to Philip's point as well, we're going to be getting into the meaty issues and the meaty topics. And there's some real fundamental questions that we need to unpack and lean into those hard questions and hard issues. And that may be at the geopolitical level, it may also be at the company level, the regulation and the policy level. But we can only do this together, and we need to be able to do this together. So thank you for enabling this conversation. It's been really fascinating and very timely. And perhaps we'll explore this or come back to this time next year and see what the predictions have come true or where we're focusing then. But can we all please thank Sarah